In our 46-foot sailboat, Winter Sea, we had sailed for years around these beautiful Gulf Islands and San Juan Islands, which lie ranged across the United States-Canadian border in the Pacific Northwest of North America. But after many marvelous cruises in these waters, we were looking farther afield. Our plan this year was to sail completely around Vancouver Island, a voyage of about 1,000 miles, which would involve passages out on the mighty North Pacific Ocean. Vancouver Island is about 300 miles long and 80 miles or so at its widest. It is mountainous and rugged with a viciously wild west coast, and is the largest island off the west coast of the Americas. Our circumnavigation of Vancouver Island began at Sydney, a small town just north of Victoria, the capital city of British Columbia, which is Canada's most westerly province. Our voyage was to take us north through these lovely islands to reach Georgia Strait, the large inland sea that separates Vancouver Island from the mainland of Canada. Here, the captain of the vessel and director of the show is pontificating to the crew how even the slightest infringement of the ship's rules could lead to flogging, hanging at the yardarm, or being thrown to the sharks. The ever-present British Columbia ferry boats, one of which is apparently disappearing right into the cliffside before our very eyes. Our voyage around Vancouver Island was to be not just a holiday, for we were going to follow in the wake of George Vancouver, the British Navy officer who, in his ship Discovery and with a support vessel Chatham, explored and charted these waters over 200 years ago. In a voyage that lasted 4.5 years, George Vancouver and the Discovery sailed over 100,000 miles and charted the west coast of North America from northern Mexico to southern Alaska. The charts and depth soundings that he made then are so accurate that many of them can be used to this day. Vancouver, as a young officer, had sailed with the great explorer Captain James Cook on his second and third voyages into the South Pacific, and actually witnessed Captain Cook's murder by Hawaiian natives in 1778. As a result of his experience with Cook and his obvious expertise with surveying and chart-making, the 32-years-old Captain George Vancouver was appointed by the British Admiralty to lead the two-ship expedition to this west coast of North America. Little did Vancouver realize that 200 years later, there would be a huge island, a major city of 2 million people, and a smaller city in the United States named after him. Having crossed Georgia Strait to the Canadian mainland, we put our dinghy in the water, and as the sun descended over the islands, went off for a beer in Gibson's Landing.
Well, here we are in Malispina Channel. Malispina was one of the original Spanish explorers who charted and mapped and explored this whole area in the 18th century. And here, this body of water, Malispina Channel, is named after him, and that body of land is the Malispina Peninsula.
Our videographer Linda is given a few minutes off to indulge her secret passion. Throughout this sailing paradise, beautiful anchorages are everywhere. Here we are crossing the shallow water at the exit from Comox Harbour, about 1/3 of the way up the east coast of Vancouver Island. At this northern end of Georgia Strait, one is reminded that George Vancouver named this inland sea not after himself, but after the reigning sovereign of the time, the intermittently mad King George III. It was named after him at about the same era as the same king was losing his North American colonies on the other side of the continent. So you win a few and you lose a few. After a few days of hard sailing, we had reached the northern end of Georgia Strait, and, since the weather was warm and sunny, we anchored for a few days in this beautiful anchorage at Gorge Harbour on Cortes Island. Here we could catch up on chores such as scrubbing the decks and washing the clothes. This powerful hand-cranked washing machine proved to be very useful. We got on our way again, and today I was looking forward to sailing into the famous Desolation Sound. On leaving Cortes Island, we sailed through this very narrow gorge exit, which gives the anchorage its name. Up there on the cliffs, there are alleged to be petroglyphs, which have been there since ancient times. There may well be, but I've been through this place several times, and I haven't seen them yet. Our arrival in Desolation Sound could not have been more splendid. As I stood in the bow of the boat, drinking in the majesty of the seascape, the mountains and the sky, I couldn't help but think of Vancouver and his crew, in their two ships, the Discovery and the Chatham. How remote all this must have seemed to them, how foreign and hostile. Here they were, having taken over a year to sail here from home, and faced now with this apparently impenetrable archipelago of islands.
Well, here we are in this truly magnificent Desolation Sound. When George Vancouver first sailed here in 1792, the weather was entirely different. Clouds were down to the treetops, the rain was pouring, the wind was howling, and he came out of his cabin, he looked around, and he was a very irascible man at the best of times. He said, "Let us call this Desolation Sound." I think George Vancouver got it all wrong. He should have seen it on a wonderful, magnificent day like this. When he got back to England, he wrote in his journal, "Our residence here was truly awful. Silence pervaded the gloomy forests, while animated nature seemed to have deserted the neighboring country." His officers wanted to call it something more spectacular than that. They regarded all of this scenery as being totally, and the 18th century word is, sublime. I suppose if they'd named it, it would have been called Sublime Sound. There is a lot of history in this piece of water. And it's interesting too, because the tides from the north part of the island and the south part of the island meet here. So there is a wildness to the water. The tides are not as predictable. The water is warmer. And it is a microclimate within these waters. Over there is Malispina Peninsula. Now, Malispina was an 18th century Spanish explorer who explored in the Philippines and California and Mexico, and actually came up to Alaska and then down the west coast of Vancouver Island. And he set two of his lieutenants in charge of two of his ships, one was the Sutil. And they named, when they discovered it, this peninsula here, Malispina. Now, in the summer, these waters are full of boating tourists, like ourselves, I suppose. There are boats heading for beautiful anchorages all around in this body of water and in the side channels that lead away from it. I think this is one of the most beautiful places in the world.
Desolation Sound is a maze of islands, narrow channels, and beautifully tranquil anchorages, all surrounded by lofty mountains, which are all snow-capped year-round. Although there are a significant number of boats here of all sorts, shapes and sizes in the summer season, the area is so vast that it never seems crowded, and a quiet anchorage can always be found. One of the loveliest and most popular is here at Pristine Haven, which is so beautiful it has to be seen to be believed. After a quiet night, at dawn we headed north through the complex maze of islands and channels that separate the northern end of George's Strait from the wider channel of Johnston Strait, which leads northwest to the open Pacific. Very soon we came to the Ukulta Rapids, the first of a series of narrow rapids through which the flooding or ebbing tides from the Pacific rush at up to 10 or 12 miles per hour. To fight against such currents is difficult and dangerous, One has to cross at slack water when the tide turns from going one way to the other. But now we were successfully through the series of rapids. Having slightly mistimed our passage, we had fought against the tide. How the young James Johnston, navigator of the Chatham, got through here with his men rowing a flimsy open boat is beyond me. But he knew that such a strong tide flooding against him meant only one thing, that there was open ocean ahead as well as behind him. And that ocean could only be the Pacific. It never ceases to amaze me how one can always find a secluded, tranquil, empty anchorage here in the cruising waters of British Columbia. Chatham Point Lighthouse, which marks the northern end of Discovery Channel, through which Vancouver eventually brought his ships Discovery and Chatham. He found himself here in what is called Johnston Strait, which he named after the intrepid young officer James Johnston, the man who had found his way through the islands and rapids. The young James Johnston came through here 215 years or so ago in an open boat, which his men rowed for 10 or 12 hours every day. They were wet, tired, cold, hungry, thirsty, and miserable with blistered hands. They were in constant danger. I couldn't help thinking about how they had to catch fish or shoot birds for food, and at night would have to find a piece of wet, rocky shore to make a miserable camp. And they had to chart and draw and make soundings of the waters they rode through, which was the reason they were there at all, but also so that they could find their way back to the motherships. We had been beating into the wind and current on Johnston Strait for hours by the time this huge pleasure palace sailed by. Johnston Strait seemed to go on and on and on. We were cold and wet and hungry. I looked at the cruise ship with its 6 restaurants, 15 bars, casinos, cinemas, theatres, 4 swimming pools and 6 hot jacuzzis, and did I envy them up there in that gin palace? No, not much. Here is Port Hardy at the northern tip of Vancouver Island, where we replenished our supplies and bought a couple of bottles of wine before heading further north towards the rocks in Charlotte Strait, where Vancouver's ship was briefly run aground, happily with no major damage. The next night we spent here at Bull Harbour on Hope Island, at the north end of Vancouver Island. This tranquil anchorage is only 200 or 300 meters from a wild beach facing the open Pacific, with huge breakers crashing onto sun-bleached driftwood. Bull Harbour was full of exotic jellyfish like these. Some of these jellyfish can have tentacles up to 30 feet long. And there was salmon in abundance, seemingly eager to jump into our boat. Bull Harbour was so peaceful that we hardly wanted to leave. We raised our anchor early next morning, and with a good weather forecast from the Canadian Maritime Weather Reporting Service, which we'd received through the VHF radio on board, we set off through the narrow exit from Bull Harbour. We were excited because today we were finally to leave the protection of the Inside Passage and venture out onto the mighty Pacific Ocean. But first, we had to cross the dreaded Nawiti Bar, marked by this red and white navigation buoy. Nawiti Bar is a bar of very shallow water across the exit to the Pacific, and when a stiff wind is blowing against the direction of the tidal current, the waves here can be huge and wild and irregular. But today, the Nawiti Bar was very tame, and the mighty Pacific somewhat less intimidating than we had anticipated. We had an exhilarating passage along the north coast of Vancouver Island towards Cape Scott. There she blows! No, I didn't really utter this hoary old cliché when we saw these whales, but I must confess that I actually thought it. To see these vast creatures up close like this is a very moving experience, and it makes me angry to think that they have been hunted and killed in the past, almost to the point of extinction. We continued to sail gently along this northwest coast of Vancouver Island, with its miles of white sand beaches and thick forest. The forest is not old growth, however, as it has been extensively logged in the past. All morning we sailed in and out of summer fog banks, which burned off later as the sun rose higher. We were surprised by the tranquility of the ocean, but it more than lived up to its fierce reputation later in our voyage. Approaching Cape Scott, the coast grew more rugged, and the ocean rollers, all the way from Japan, grew more pronounced. Cape Scott Lighthouse. It looks more like somebody's backyard outhouse. As we turned the northwest corner of Vancouver Island, marking the halfway point of our voyage around the island, the coast grew more wild and rugged. We turned the corner and sailed southeast. It's not difficult to see why this west coast of Vancouver Island got the name the Graveyard of the Pacific. Over the past 200 years, hundreds of ships have been wrecked along it and thousands of sailors drowned. Kane's Island Lighthouse stands over the entrance to Quatsino Sound, the first of the 5 great inlets or sounds that are a feature of this west coast of Vancouver Island. Tucked away inside the entrance to Quatsino Sound is the beautifully quiet and sheltered anchorage at Winter Harbour, where we spent that next night. The next morning we set off into the teeth of a strong wind and a disturbed sea. Later we reached the Brooks Peninsula with Cape Cook and the towering rock of Solander Island off its shore. This great rocky island is named after Daniel Solander, a botanist who, together with the great amateur botanist Sir Joseph Banks, accompanied James Cook on the first of his great exploratory voyages into the Pacific Ocean in 1758. James Cook was perhaps the greatest explorer and chartmaker of his day. He was also a great naval sea captain who looked after his crew so well that few of them died, particularly of scurvy, which often decimated ships' crews. He had listened to the advice of scientists of the day who recommended fresh food, particularly vegetables and fruit, to prevent that dreaded disease. He literally forced them to eat vegetables when available, and when they ran out of them, any edible greenery that he could find on shore.
Very first salmon that I ever caught here in, where are we? Esperanza Inlet. We're heading for Tarsus. It's a wonderful feeling. It's a primitive hunter feeling. Whoa!
Shortly after I caught my fish, we spotted this pod of extremely rare Risso's dolphins. These animals are infrequently seen inshore in places like this. They're much more likely to be seen, when at all, long distances offshore. Also called a grey dolphin, they have a curious tall dorsal fin and are larger than other dolphins at about 12 feet long. After the rough weather of the past few days, we wanted to rest up and dry out. We docked at a beautiful little spot in Tarsus, a lovely community several miles from the sea at the head of its own deep-sea inlet. The last time I had been here, 10 or so years before, Tarsus had several large ships from all over the world, loading up with lumber from the large lumber mill, the major employer in the village. The mill has since closed down, so the population of 3,000 or so has now dwindled to a few hundreds. The people remaining in this beautiful, calm backwater now rely mainly on tourism and boat people like ourselves. We headed back down Tarsus Inlet towards the sea at Nootka Sound. The vile weather improved, and we were heading towards Friendly Cove in Nootka Island. In many ways, our visit to Nootka was to be the focal point of our voyage in the wake of George Vancouver. As the wind had died, we slid gently under power into Friendly Cove, an anchorage nestling behind the protection of the San Rafael Lighthouse and a narrow isthmus of land protecting it from the breakers of the Pacific Ocean. I had long looked forward to this moment, dropping our anchor in the very spot where George Vancouver had dropped the anchor of the Discovery over 200 years ago. There was a bigger community here then, of the local natives and of the governing colonizers, the Spanish. Otherwise, it looked much the same.
Here we are in Friendly Cove on Nootka Island. You may ask why we are here. We're here because the Spanish colonized it in the 18th century. Why did they do that, you ask? Because hundreds of years before that, the Pope, in his wisdom, issued a document called the Papal Donation, in which Pope Julius II gave the whole of the Western Hemisphere to Spain to explore and to colonize and to exploit, and he gave the whole of the Eastern Hemisphere to Portugal to do likewise. And so, in the years that followed that, Spain colonized Chile and Mexico and California, and the Portuguese in the east colonized India and the East Indies, which is now Indonesia, and China. And that was the way the world was divided. Well, we're here in Nootka Island at Friendly Cove, and we've just run into Pat McNally, who is from Medicine Hat in Alberta, and he's got an interesting story to tell.
Yeah, about 2 nights ago we were sleeping on the island. It was raining like crazy. In the middle of the night, all of a sudden we heard or felt an earthquake, and I was lying face down. It just was really quite exciting, I'll tell you, because I've never felt anything like that in my life. And then we recorded the time. It was about 1:40 in the morning, and then my wife told me there was 2 aftershocks after that. I slept through those. And then the next day we heard it was a 6.1, and the epicenter was at Nootka Sound.
Now, the first European to set eyes on this Pacific Ocean was Balboa in 1513, who crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot and gazed upon the Pacific, upon a peak at Darien, as the poet had it. Now, in subsequent years, the Spanish colonized the whole of South America and Central America and California, except, and this was significant for the Portuguese, Pope Julius in 1493 had made the demarcation line 48 degrees west of Greenwich, which gave the Portuguese Brazil. Lucky for them. During those subsequent years, the Spanish gradually took over more and more of this part of the world. And after a few years, the Spanish regarded the Pacific Ocean as their own private lake. But not everybody agreed with the way that the Pope had divided up the spoils. The British, for instance, began to make encroaches onto this part of the world. Sir Francis Drake, during his first circumnavigation of the world, which was the very first circumnavigation of the world by anybody, raided various Spanish ports on the west coast of North America. And in the east, the Dutch gradually pushed out the Portuguese. So by the 18th century, the Spanish were almost totally in charge of this part of the world, but they then heard that the Russians were moving into Alaska. Now, this interested them a great deal. So in the late part of the 18th century, they began to look northward along the western coast of what is now Canada. Now, in 1778, Captain James Cook, one of the great navigators of all time, came to this part of the world, and he actually came into this Nootka Sound. And when his ship approached, the very friendly Nootka Indians were shouting out to him, "Achia Nootka, Achia Nootka," which meant, no, not there, around here, around here. But James Cook thought that they were telling him that this place was called Nootka, so that's how Nootka got its name. So when the Spanish came up here, they came into Nootka Sound, and they actually started a colony right here in Nootka, and particularly here in Friendly Cove on Nootka Island. In 1791, Captain George Vancouver was sent out from Great Britain, and he had 3 tasks to accomplish. The first one was what he did so brilliantly well, and that was to chart and to sound all of this coast from San Francisco north of Vancouver Island. He did that brilliantly well. One of his other tasks was to search for the Northwest Passage, or at least to prove that the Northwest Passage
didn't really exist. But the third of his tasks was to come to Nootka and negotiate with the Spanish for the future of this part of the world. Now, George Vancouver arrived here and he met Captain Boudega y Quadra, usually just called Captain Quadra. And they met and discussed and discussed and discussed and got nowhere. So eventually they sent the problem back to Madrid and to London to be solved. But during the course of that time, Quadra and Vancouver became extraordinarily close friends. They entertained each other on each other's ships to sumptuous dinners and fine wines, though I suspect that the Spanish wine was somewhat better than the British wine. They became such good friends that Quadra suggested to Vancouver that they should name some significant body of water or significant piece of land after themselves. Now, Vancouver had just proved the insularity of Vancouver Island. And so Quadra said, why don't we call this island that we now know is an island, Quadra's and Vancouver's Island? So thus it was. The first name of this big island was Quadra's and Vancouver's Island. Bit of a mouthful, but in subsequent years the Quadra bit was dropped, and because of increasing British influence it was totally lost and forgotten. It was then called Vancouver's Island, and then the Z disappeared and it became simply Vancouver Island, which is what it's called today.
During the time of Captain Quadra's Spanish governorship here and George Vancouver's visit, the population of Friendly Cove was about 1,500 people. Now it's reduced to about 20. The focus of the present village is this beautiful old church, within which are two magnificent stained glass windows, a gift from the government of Spain in 1957 to the natives here to commemorate the meeting between Quadra and Vancouver in 1792. The Pacific Ocean here in the backyard almost of the village of Friendly Cove is wild, restless and beautiful. The back doors of the few buildings, including the church, open out onto this magnificent vista. Back to the mothership again for a glass of wine, a good dinner and a quiet night at anchor. Life does not get any better than this. The next morning we headed south on the Pacific towards Estevan Point Lighthouse, the only place in Canada to be attacked by an enemy since the Americans did it in 1812. On the 20th of June 1942, a Japanese submarine opened fire on the lighthouse. Not much damage was done. The people of Canada were outraged and astonished, but not as much as the lighthouse keeper and his wife. The anchorage at Hot Springs Cove, halfway down the west coast of Vancouver Island. James Cook, George Vancouver and their crews were not as addicted to immersing their bodies in hot water as we are, so they very probably did not land here. We walked the 1.5-mile boardwalk through this lovely coastal rainforest, crossing the carved names of some of the vessels that have come here towards the natural hot springs set on the cliffs. Linda, our cinematographer, was allowed a few minutes off to frolic in the scaldingly hot water. She particularly enjoyed the cooling effect of the waves meeting the hot water at the foot of the cliff. The return journey through the rainforest, feeling clean, refreshed and relaxed, was delightful. The sun shone in dappled patterns through the branches and leaves, the birds sang and the squirrels chattered. Truly a memorable day. The next day we ducked behind a group of large islands which sheltered us from the Pacific Ocean and sailed south on a hot, sunny, exhilarating day. As we woke the next morning, We found, high in this tree overlooking our anchorage, an eagle's nest with a mother eagle tending her babies. Some babies. They were the size of good-sized turkeys and were eager to stretch their wings. This one was very pleased with himself, as he had followed his mother's warning not to foul the nest. Sailing south towards Tofino, we came upon yet more humpbacked whales. There were more of them than we could count. Judging by the accounts of some of Cook's and Vancouver's officers, there were so many whales then that there were whales constantly in sight, or not just once in a while like today. And one lone eagle, perched on his rock, silently watched us glide by through the sandbanks, reefs and shoals approaching Tofino. Tofino is a busy little fishing port and tourist centre with supermarkets, shops, hotels, restaurants and bars. But we didn't need any of those things. There were boats everywhere, but our plan called for us to go beyond Tofino and on to Ucluelet, another bigger fishing port 20 miles south. Amphitrite Point Lighthouse guards the entrance to Ucluelet Harbour and Barclay Sound. We had to navigate our way through a maze of rocky islands and reefs, a viciously dangerous part of the coast. This was a fine day. Try to imagine what it's like when the wind blows hard and the sea is wild. After provisioning in Ucluelet, we found a tranquil anchorage in Barclay Sound, the most southerly of the great inlets of the west coast of Vancouver Island. The next day dawned bright and beautiful, and we simply revelled in the sheer joy of sailing among the many lovely islands of Barclay Sound, the so-called broken group of islands. Sailing has been described by some wag as the art of going nowhere, very slowly, very uncomfortably, at great expense. I would define it differently, but then I would, wouldn't I? Whilst sailing along in Barclay Sound, we were joined by this group of Steller sea lions. They were first described by Georg Steller, a German naturalist who was with Bering on his voyage to Alaska in 1741. They are huge animals, the males weighing over 2,000 pounds. They've been a protected species since 1970, and their numbers are said to be increasing again. This does not please everyone, however. Commercial fishermen regard them as rivals in their quest for fish. They are very curious beasts. This group was very interested in what we were doing and would nuzzle and bite at the hull of the boat. At times they would reach up out of the sea and look right into our faces. It was moving to look into the large brown eyes of these intelligent animals. They swam and frolicked along with us for over an hour, before disappearing just as quickly as they had arrived. This, for me, was one of the highlights of our voyage. The day was magnificent, and after the sea lions left, we continued to sail across Barclay Sound and indulged in some heavy-duty fishing.
We caught a red snapper, though he doesn't seem to be snapping very much.
We continued across Barclay Sound to the small fishing port of Bamfield. We usually anchor wherever we go, but Bamfield was so quiet and empty that we tied up to a dock for a change. This gave me an opportunity to indulge in a favourite onboard pastime: reading. Bamfield has lots of flying activity, from herons to float planes. Bamfield is quiet now compared to former times. There used to be a much bigger fishing fleet. Now it is used by sport fishermen and tourists. It also marks the northern end of the Pacific Coast Trail, the rugged hike along the wild coast between Port Renfrew and Bamfield. The Strait of Juan de Fuca marks the border between the United States on the south side and Canada to the north. It is 70 miles or so long and averages about 20 miles wide. It can be a very wild piece of water, with winds often howling in from the west, but on this day it was like a millpond. It's named after a Greek sailor, Apostolos Severianos, who worked for the Spanish Navy, but who evidently didn't like the idea of a mere Greek sailing for them, so they renamed him Juan de Fuca. In 1592 he sailed up the west coast from Acapulco and discovered this vast inlet. He thought he'd found a way through to the Atlantic Ocean. There are few suitable anchorages in this long Strait of Juan de Fuca, so we had a long sailing day until we reached this beautiful, quiet haven at Souk Harbour, a world apart from the open Pacific. Passing Race Rock's lighthouse the next day, guarding the eastern end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, we were on our way towards Victoria, the charming capital city of the province of British Columbia. Although Victoria is the capital city of British Columbia, it is by no means the largest. Vancouver, named after our man George, has that honour. Victoria, however, is an older community than Vancouver. By the middle of the 19th century, Victoria, called Fort Victoria, was already an established seaport at the time when Vancouver was still a rough and ready little group of hovels called Town. But it was the familiar old story of the west coast of North America. It was the town that got the terminus of the great transcontinental railway system that grew larger, whilst Victoria remained smaller, quainter, and more human scale. The stately Empress Hotel is named, like the city, after Queen Victoria, who was also Empress of India. Her tall, dark statue gazes out at this inner harbour, with her back to this other grand building, the Legislature of British Columbia, the seat of government in this large province. Victoria is a soft, beautiful, gentle city with sea on two sides of it. It has been likened to a provincial town in England and makes a big tourist feature of its Englishness, with double-decker red buses, open carriages, and many English fish and chip shops. One may also take afternoon tea in the elegant former foyer of the Empress Hotel, provided that you are not on too tight a budget. Captain George Vancouver, Royal Navy, on the highest pinnacle of the BC Legislature. I wandered about in the elegant grounds of this beautiful building, with its sundials, flower beds, and fountains, and thought about the man who had been its architect, Francis Rattenbury. Rats to his friends. As a very young apprentice architect, he had come out from Yorkshire in England and won the lucrative, prestigious contract to design this building. The Pacific Grace, one of a number of tall ships based in Victoria, which are sail training ships that take young people out on ocean cruises to learn the ropes, as well as to continue their ordinary schoolwork. I thought again about Francis Rattenbury. This harbour is surrounded by buildings he designed, the BC Legislature, the Canadian Pacific Shipping Office with its pillared portico, and of course the Empress Hotel, where later in life Rats fell in love with Alma, a young piano player in the lounge of the hotel. He made her his mistress, moved her into his house, much to the distress of his wife Florence. Subsequently, divorced from Florence, he married the much younger Alma and moved back to England. Alma took a fancy to the 18-year-old chauffeur gardener George, who subsequently, shortly afterwards, murdered old Rats. Alma and George were tried for murder. Alma was acquitted. George was sentenced to hang. He was later reprieved and spent years in jail. What a story. Unmoved by all that scandal, James Cook stands facing the lobby of the Empress Hotel, perhaps wishing that he had been here around 200 years later, so that he could enjoy one of their world-famous martinis. And behind him, across the harbour, stands the statue of Juan Francisco de Boudega y Quadra, Captain Quadra, dedicated personally here by the King of Spain, King Juan Carlos, in 1984. And 200 yards away, atop the Legislature building, is the gilded statue of George Vancouver. So they're all here, surveying the scene and not realizing perhaps how important they have been in the history of Vancouver Island. Our final night in this beautiful inner harbour of Victoria was perfect. A soft, warm night under a gibbous moon, with the British Columbia Legislature spectacularly illuminated like some scene in Disneyland. We left Victoria, rounded the lighthouse at Trial Island, and turned north for the first time in many weeks. Back in the sea lanes of Haro Strait, we had almost closed the circle of our circumnavigation of Vancouver Island. This great freighter, piled high with shipping containers, probably from China, was heading into the port of Vancouver. From Victoria we headed into the lovely archipelago of the San Juan Islands and Gulf Islands. We had had a glorious several weeks of voyaging, and had followed in the wake of George Vancouver to many of the places that he had explored and charted under desperately arduous conditions over 200 years ago. We had had it much softer. But we also had witnessed some of the places where James Cook had voyaged. He is generally known as Captain Cook, but in fact, having come up through the ranks and not regarded by the Admiralty as a gentleman, never made it to captain, but remained a lieutenant to his dying day at the hands of Hawaiian natives. We have also come to realize the toughness and the cleverness of the early Spanish explorers in this region. Galliano, Valdez, Malispina, Quadra, and that Spanish adoptee, Juan de Fuca. What extraordinary men they must have been. Since we had several days to spare before heading home, we had a gentle cruise through this most amazing cruising area. This gave us time, lots of time, to reflect on what we had seen and done. There is great satisfaction in making a circumnavigation, whether it be of the world or of a large island. And now that we had closed the loop, the great circle as it were, there was great neatness to it. Having dodged the increasingly abundant sea kayakers, so close to the water that they are not always easily visible, we made our way south through the islands and channels towards Brentwood on the Brentwood Inlet, north of Victoria. We were also careful not to get tangled up with this racing fleet near Maple Bay. Our aim was to anchor close to the world-famous Butchart Gardens to take in the last firework display of the summer season. One of the surprises of discovery was how close to being a Spanish colony this part of North America was in the late 18th century. But for Vancouver and the Nootka Convention, Vancouver Island might be Spanish-speaking today. Not that there's anything wrong in being Spanish-speaking, it's just that it would be an astonishingly different demographic. People come to Brentwood and Butchart Gardens from all over the world to see the exquisitely managed set of beautiful gardens of all types. The gardens are impressively landscaped in the area of what, over 100 years ago, was a gravel quarry. On Saturday nights in the summer season, boaters of all kinds come for miles to witness the fireworks. It is a great joy to enter a narrow inlet which opens into the wide lagoon of Todd Inlet, and to drop anchor to eat and wait for dusk and the fireworks to start. We found ourselves talking about the adventure we had just completed, all the sights and sounds that we had recorded, and made plans for our next voyage. Would it be north to Alaska or south to Mexico? Who knew? Perhaps we would head into the South Pacific to voyage in the wake of James Cook and see the place where he was killed at Kealakekua Bay on the big island of Hawaii. It was exciting to make plans. The fireworks seemed like a fitting celebration to the end of our voyage, but for George Vancouver, that extraordinary explorer, heading home from Vancouver's Island after his 4.5 years voyage was the beginning of the end of his life. After being unwell for most of the last year of his exploration, he returned home at the end of 1795 and died 2 years later, probably of tuberculosis. The great journal that he began to write about his voyage was completed by his brother John. The simple headstone in the churchyard at Petersham in England simply states, Captain George Vancouver, died in the year 1798, age 40.